The United Nations defines a refugee as a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted that is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself to the protection of that country and is unable to, or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to that country. In the summer of 2015, Europe experienced the highest influx of refugees since World War II. The main reason for this is that Syria has become the world's top source of refugees. Syria has been led by the al-Assad family since the 1960s, until the Arab Spring, the revolutionary wave of protests and conflicts that began in the Arab world in 2011 and has toppled many authoritarian regimes. The Assads refused to step down, which began a civil war that is now in its 5th year. Different religious and ethnic groups took this opportunity to rise up and fight for control of Syria in the form of various government forces, rebel factions, and terrorist organizations. All combatants have committed war crimes, including mass executions, chemical warfare, and torture. Civilians in Syria are trapped between different regimes, rebel groups, and the religious extremists. Currently, many nations around the world carry out airstrikes in Syria, which only further the need for escape from the war-torn country. More than 4 million Syrians have registered or are awaiting registration with the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees. The majority of Syrian refugees, 95%, are living in neighboring countries such as Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Lebanon. The UNHCR was unprepared for a refugee crisis on this scale, and as a result, many of the refugee camps are underfunded and are lacking in supplies. Facing what seemed like a loss of all hope, the refugees have begun to travel to Europe by crossing the Mediterranean Sea for the opportunity to start anew in a different land. There are many people within Europe and all over the world who are scared of taking in such a large and mostly Muslim population into their country. However, many fears held by these people are unwarranted and essentially come from a lack of understanding of the refugees and Islam.
All over the West, more and more people are beginning to take action, although support for asylum seekers has mostly come from citizens, not from politicians. But there are fears in the Western world: Islam, high birth rates, crime, and the collapse of the social systems. Let's acknowledge this and look at the facts. Even if the EU alone were to accept all 4 million Syrian refugees and 100% of them were Muslims, the percentage of Muslims in the European Union would only rise from about 4% to about 5%. This is not a drastic change and will certainly not make it a Muslim continent. A Muslim minority is neither new nor reason to be afraid. Birth rates in many parts of the Western world are low, so some fear asylum seekers might overtake the native population in a few decades. Studies have shown that even though birth rates are higher among Muslims in Europe, they drop and adjust as the standard of living and level of education rises. Most Syrian refugees already are educated. The birth rate in Syria before the civil war was not very high, and the population was actually shrinking, not growing. The fear that refugees lead to higher crime rates also turns out to be wrong. Refugees who become immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than the native population. When allowed to work, they tend to start businesses and integrate themselves into the workforce as fast as possible, paying more into the social systems than they extract from them. Syrians coming to the West are potential professional workers desperately needed to sustain Europe's aging population.
Refugees are people fleeing armed conflict or persecution. The denial of asylum of these people could have deadly consequences. Refugees also have certain rights under international law, since the United Nations Treaty, the Convention relating to the status of refugees, which was passed in 1951. These rights include the right of a refugee to not be returned to their country if their safety cannot be assured, the right to not be penalized for entering a country illegally if they request asylum, and the rights to primary education and religious expression. Once a refugee has entered a country, that country has legal obligations to ensure the protection of that refugee. Those who deny the acceptance of the Syrian refugees do so out of fear, as opposed to the love Pope Francis has called us to share. Pope Francis, after his visit to the Greek island of Lesbos, where many refugees are currently situated, brought back 12 refugees with him to the Vatican. The Vatican said in a statement that Pope Francis wanted to make a gesture of welcome to the refugees. As Christians, it is our duty to help the poor and vulnerable. Therefore, it is our duty to help refugees fleeing persecution in any way we can. One of the key themes of Catholic social teaching is the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, which calls for the preference being given to the well-being of the poor and powerless of society in the teachings of God. Everyone is made in God's image, and so we must extend love and care to those suffering. Many countries, including the United States, are reluctant to openly accept the Syrian refugees into their countries. As Christians, we should make it the duty of our government to make sure protection and help is given to the refugees, even if that means sending supplies and equipment to refugee camps, or even welcoming the Syrian refugees into our country.